This is Burke. It's 12 days north of hopeless and a few degrees south of freezing to death. It's located solidly on the meridian of misery. My village. In a word, sturdy. And it's been here for 7 generations, but every single building is new. We have fishing, hunting, and a charming view of the sunsets. The only problems are the pests. You see, most places have mice or mosquitoes. We have dragons. A natterhead is sure to get me at least noticed. Gronckles are tough. Taking down one of those would definitely get me a girlfriend. A Zippleback? Exotic. 2 heads, twice the status.
They found the sheep!
Concentrate fire over the lower bank!
Hurry up! Fire!
And then there's the monstrous nightmare. Only the best Vikings go after those. They have this nasty habit of setting themselves on fire.
Reload! I'll take care of this.
But the ultimate prize is the dragon no one's ever seen. We call it the
Night Fury! Get down!
This thing never steals food, never shows itself, and never misses. Come on. Give me something to shoot at. Give me something to shoot at.
So, listening to that sequence makes me want to talk about mixing right off the bat. And so I'm going to say a couple of words and then turn it over to Gary Rizzo, who was my co-mixer on the movie. A couple of things to notice about the sequence. One is the use of dynamics. Those of us who work in movie sound are used to hearing lots of criticisms from moviegoers about how loud movies are. Of course, most movie theaters don't play movies anywhere near as loud as we mix them, so my first response is often, actually, you have no idea how loud movies really are. But one of the great things about the way that Chris and Dean designed this movie is that there are lots of opportunities for dynamics. There are moments, invitations to be really loud and intense and powerful, but those typically last only for a few seconds or a minute or two, and then you have a valley in which you can populate with much sparser set of sounds, and then that sets you up for the next peak in terms of loudness and intensity. And another overall thing to say is that when you watch a sequence like this, you should pay attention to the use of audio spectrum. You may have noticed that the explosions that happen are very low frequency intensive. And we do that on purpose so that the explosion can seem powerful, can seem to be having an effect on the whole environment that it occupies without being ear-piercingly loud, which is what it would have to be if you didn't have all those low frequencies, if you relied entirely on mid and high frequencies for the intensity of the explosion. You want to take that ball and run with it for a bit, Gary?
Sure, why not? I think I'll start by saying this movie was an absolute fantastic mix experience for me. I had more fun mixing on this movie than I have on most other movies. It was a playground. The biggest challenge was that there were so many good sounds and so many good options for us to consider that it made it really difficult because it was all good stuff. I mean, just even starting with the score. The score is it's textured, it's deep, but it's storytelling in and of itself. It's got some wonderful rhythms to it. The percussion elements that were in there I thought were incredibly thorough, that helped the pace and helped things move along. Of course, Randy and Al and the sound effects team brought together some astounding sound design elements to enhance the storytelling throughout the movie, but it was just all so good. It was a matter of what do we play and when do we play and how do we make this work in a flow. So it really was a lot of choices that we make, and when we're mixing, I don't know how many of you have actually been on a working dub stage or not, but we're making a million decisions a minute, or at least it feels that way. We're trying to make the best decisions that we can make based upon all those things that Randy's talking about. At any given moment, there may be dialogue going on, voiceover, that really has to cut through. At the same time, we want to play the momentum of what's actually going on, whether it's Hiccup running through the town with, I forget the name of the device, I apologize, that he's wheeling through.
Catapult.
The catapult element the
Mangler,
that's the word I was looking for. At any given time, there's something going on in the storytelling process that we certainly want to convey, and we want to keep the momentum, we want to keep the energy, and yet there are some things that just aren't going to play because they're so detailed that maybe it's not the right thing to play at any given time. And that was really our job on this, was to figure out the best of the best that helped with the storytelling to kind of get us through. John Null, I got to give a shout out to him. I know he's not here tonight, but he did an astounding job to get all the dialogue elements together and to get all the loop group elements together and to provide some fantastic sync, because sync in animation sometimes can be, challenging. It was really a lot of decisions happening at any given moment where we wanted to make the greatest experience we could. The voiceover, we know we wanted to come through. We wanted the music to support that without overwhelming it, and we wanted the momentum with sound effects and sound design in this sequence to kind of get us through. That said, I don't know how many of you know about the process that we do, and I'll try to make it quick here so that you kind of get it, at least from the mixing side of things. Editorial happens ahead of time. It could be 6 or 8 weeks before we even start mixing, depending upon the size of the show, the budget, the schedule. But we break things down by categories, where we have pre-dubbing, basically, where we work on one category of sound at a time. It's pretty easy to describe for dialogue pre-dubbing, where we take all of the chosen takes of recordings for the spoken word and we make it work within the universe of the movie. So if a character for an animated film is in a house, we have got to make him sound like he's in a house. If he's outside, we got to make him sound like he's outside. That kind of thing. We got to make all the dialogue work in the dialogue pre-dub in and of itself. We also, getting over into sound effects, we break things down into categories. Explosions all go together. We try to make all the explosions work. All the ambiences, we try to make all the ambiences work. And it's broken down from there. Foley is in its own category. We do all these pre-dubs, and we try to make them work balanced all together in anticipation of the final mix, which is really where we put it all up together and make those critical decisions at the end. And that's typically the first time where music starts getting involved too. So that said, there's a million decisions that go into that, and we're always trying to think about the frequencies that are within any given element and the storytelling process on top of it, on top of just how loud or how soft any moment plays, dynamic range. It's something that we work really hard to get all those things right so that it plays the way that you expect it to when you see it in the theater. How was that?
I'll remind you too that unlike live action where you have production tracks to work from the stage, you guys start from scratch. So every element is culled and combined and put together. The production dialogue is really the only thing that you have to work with from our end.
One thing that we've started doing in the last few years, and we did on How to Train Your Dragon, is to do what we call virtual pre-mixing, which means that the sounds that arrive at the final mix of the film are in a Pro Tools session. And for those few of you in the room who might not know what Pro Tools is, it's the sound editing and design and mixing workstation that is most commonly used in film work. Virtually every sound that has been cut, at least all of the sounds that have been selected for possible use in the film, are in that Pro Tools session and in sync. We didn't commit to any particular mix of sound effects before the final mix, and that gives us an enormous number of options in the final mix, because we, as Gary said, we often don't hear at least the final music for the film until the first day of the final mix, and so there's no way to anticipate exactly what sound effects are going to work with certain pieces of music, and we always do a certain amount of scrambling and modifying of the sound effects to work with music, and that's made much easier by this virtual sound editing and sound mixing process.
That said, for our show, the sound effects were all pre-mixed virtually, were they not? The dialogue and the Foley was pre-mixed traditionally in a console and then printed back to a recorder, and then the final mix was done in a traditional way on a DFC on one of our large stages. So it was kind of a hybrid show to some degree. Randy and I have both done shows on both sides of the spectrum too, where we've done completely virtual shows almost all the way through to Printmaster, and we've both done traditional shows within the console all the way through.
Why don't we play the next clip, which is a piece of. So you want to say something?
Before we go any further, one of the things I wanted to talk about, just to frame something up, is that I wanted to really point out something that the sound effects and the mix are so incredibly believable that I think that you, in some ways, take it for granted in an animated film. And one of the things I wanted to talk about just briefly to frame the whole thing up is that when we start our relationship, we talk about just, well, what sort of film is this, before anybody's ever really seen much, and we're always, still in process. A lot of our stuff takes a long time before it's actually lit and textured, and you really see it the way it's going to be seen on the screen. And when we started this film, we learned that DreamWorks had made some huge advances in their textures, and one of the things that I want you to take a look at and notice is the lighting on this film is very, very different. Roger Deakins came in to help us with our lighting, and rather than start our sequences with a piece of artwork that we would match the lighting to, these sets and creatures were all built, and then it was lit interactively, meaning Roger Deakins and our lighters walked on these sets and they lit them like you would light a real set. And so the lighting on this film is very, very spare, and the textures are very believable. And so that was for us the operative word throughout this entire process, is believability. We wanted a real, we knew what this film was going to look like when it was lit and it was final. And we all talked about just the weight of believability. And I think that was the operative word in this whole thing, is sophistication and weight and believability. And Dean and I are such believers in sound. We always say that we work very, very hard to get 50% of the film done, and that sound is the other 50%, and it's a make or break thing. You either support the film and you enhance it, or you could really undermine it, and you could really work against what the film is going to feel like and look like. And I guess as you watch this, I want you to pay attention to the way the film looks and the way that the sound has been designed and how the mix has worked to seamlessly create what I think is a very believable world.
A natterhead is sure to get me at least noticed. Gronckles are tough. Taking down one of those would definitely get me a girlfriend. A zippleback? Exotic. 2 heads, twice the status.
They found the sheep!
Concentrate fire over the lower bank!
Hurry up! Fire!
And then there's the monstrous nightmare. Only the best Vikings go after those. They have this nasty habit of setting themselves on fire.
Reload! I'll take care of this.
But the ultimate prize is the dragon no one's ever seen. We call it the
Night Fury! Get down! Jump!
So obviously that was the dialogue stem, the music stem, and the sound effects stem of the final mix of that sequence.
That's a good example of how you can see, especially with the explosions, going with some low-end elements, and even in the music stem, you can hear how we're kind of moving some of the brass elements out of the way, leaving the percussion elements. The voiceover, of course, stays on top, and we try to get all those words through. But you can kind of hear through a cross-section of how we kind of get those elements, the important elements, to cut through while keeping the pulse and keeping the momentum of things.
Yeah, the essential trick in a sequence like that is to find a way to make the audience feel like they're hearing everything, when really they're hearing at least an attempted graceful changing of focus from one set of sounds to another set of sounds. So in one moment we're concentrating on the voiceover, in another moment on the music, and another moment on the sound effects.
This is one scene where I was so happy to finally have the mix. Every time we'd show it to the executives, we'd get the note, we need to hear the dialogue, and then the next time, well, we need to hear the effects, and the next time, we need to hear the music. And so, there's only so much you can do in the Avid with temp tracks, and it was just such a joy to finally hear everything together, and it was something that I was highly anticipating. So,
Took us a while to get there.
Yeah, it really is an incredible negotiation. And it was interesting hearing the stems again and to hear things starting to move out of the way of other things. And you can tell when something's heading in, like, okay, it's getting out of the way here, something's coming through here, something else is coming through here, then it rises back up again. Oh, effect on. It's amazing. It's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, and you never know exactly how it's going to work until you start playing with it. You might think that somebody who's been doing this thing as long as we have would be able to somehow anticipate in advance, oh, at this point we're going to do this so that we can hear the narration, etc. But you really never know. After 30 years of doing this, more than 30 years, I never know until I start playing with the sounds and until we start experimenting with the sounds, exactly how you're going to tailor each moment to present the story in the way it needs to be presented.
It's also an example of how different everybody's voice really is. Jay's voice has this pretty unique narrow frequency range that kind of, I feel like I had to compress it more than I normally would to kind of get it to sit right there. You would think that it would be something that would kind of be almost compressed by itself just based on its frequency range, but it was something that I felt like I had to contain more than I would have thought I would have to get it to sit in with everything else. And it actually turned out to be pretty, he cuts through pretty well without being too bitey.
The next clip that we want to play is a part of the climactic battle sequence from the movie that centers on this really, really horrific dragon called the Green Death. It's so horrific that all the other dragons are scared to death of it. And I think it'll illustrate yet more aspects of how we do this tailoring.
Watch out! Okay, time's up. Let's see if this works. Come on! They're the best you can do! Stay with me, buddy. We're good. Just a little bit longer. Hold, Toothless.
Hiccup! Son!
Did he survive?
You'll have to get that DVD to find out.
Blu-ray.
That's right.
Get your 3D Blu-ray.
For those of you who haven't seen the film, the small dragon that the young man was riding is named Toothless, and in a way he's the star of the whole show. And we're going to talk more about Toothless a little bit later. But the giant dragon is the one called the Green Death. Anybody want to start off by saying anything about that sequence?
Well, we should talk about the scale of that dragon. That dragon is huge. it's like moving Texas around. That dragon was one of the last things we built for the movie. It's interesting that those two dragons, they're really the two things you see in the climax there. Both of those dragons were built for the movie really at the last minute. We made some last minute changes to the story, and both of those dragons represent a bit of a miracle because it usually takes about a year to build, surface, rig, test, and perfect a character and get them all ready to actually come out of the garage and be animated. And both of those characters were built in about 3 months, from 0 to actually running. And it's something that only I know, like, that dragon is so big. You can get so close to that thing, and like every little scale on it, you could zoom into it. It's perfect. So I'm not even sure how they texture something that big. I think they have teams of people working overnight. But yeah, it's a pretty giant scale thing. It's wonderful to hear that whole sequence again, because just the scale of that thing is really terrifying. It's amazing to hear it again.
Sure, and it encourages the visual dynamic range that you have in this movie that we kind of had to try to keep up with sonically. You can get that close.
And normally I can't, it takes a few years before I can look at something that I've worked on for 2 years straight to really go back and be able to watch it. But watching this again, it's just so exciting, and I get pulled in again, especially on the stage here.
One thing you might have noticed about the sound effects in the sequence is that certain kinds of sounds, like the fire breathing and some of the flybys, have a quite noticeable pitch change element to them. And I shouldn't say this because it's giving away trade secrets, and some of you are probably going to take my job next week, but I'll say it anyway. In a sequence like that, that's very loud, and as a sound designer, sound effects editor, you're struggling to make a particular sound audible that's competing with lots of other sounds. One of the principal tricks is to choose a sound or fabricate a sound that changes in pitch over time. So in the case of a flyby, it goes, or actually a fire breath could sound almost the same. But the magic thing about something that changes in pitch is that it grabs the human ear. It's not just a steady state noise. There's a dynamic in terms of the pitch, and it forces you to pay attention to it. And so in addition to simply lowering all the competing sounds, which is another option, and of course we wind up doing that to some degree also, this pitch change option helps us enormously. Since we're talking about sound design anyway, in terms of trying to change pitch of sounds, why don't we begin talking about what I think is the purest form of sound design, which is creature vocalizations. Lots of people send audition tapes to me, sound design audition tapes, and the vast majority of them are pretty interesting, and the vast majority have very kind of oddball sound effects, because I think people think the stranger a sound is, the more interesting it is, which is not always the case. And sometimes what I reply to the people who send me these is, if you really want to impress me, send me creature vocalizations, because that's the toughest thing to do in sound design, because you're essentially creating a character. And in this film, we had to not only create characters using voice design for a number of dragons, the dragons' emotions varied enormously from time to time, from moment to moment in the movie. And so certain dragons needed to sound comical in addition to sounding vicious and like they could bite your heads off. And so Al, why don't you talk a little bit about
dragon vocals.
Dragon vocals.
Sure. So this movie, I think, as we've all said, was a lot of fun. And I think one of the reasons it was so much fun from a sound and sound design aspect was that it had all of these unique characters in it. In this case, the dragons. And as we were working with Chris and Dean and Darren, from the beginning we were still getting early art and early animatics and getting a sense of who these dragons were. And of course there's Toothless, who, as Randy said, we're going to talk about. And his design was, he's almost like a speaking character in the movie in many ways. And that will be exposed more later. But in addition to Toothless, we had quite a handful of other dragons. And so we'd meet with the filmmakers, and they would not say things like, this one roars here and this one roars there. It was all of these emotional, sort of humanistic descriptions. This one's belchy, and this one's chortles, and he snickers and sneers and purrs, and all of these things that your average mammal doesn't necessarily do, at least not on command. And so we had to create characters without using language. So this required a pretty vast palette of sound source. We couldn't just go and record lions and tigers and bears and pitch change them and come up with a snickering natter and a chortling zippleback, and who happens to have two heads, and they're both going at the same time. So they have to be unique even within themselves. And as the story goes through the movie, sometimes you have these dragons all interacting with each other. So you need to be able to identify them. So they really need to be unique. And it was a big challenge. Luckily, we had lots of great people. So I'm going to segue quickly to thank our editorial crew briefly. Along with Randy and the gang here, and John Null, who was the other supervisor who couldn't be here. Our dialogue gang was Brian Chumney, Chris Gridley. Our sound effects and sound design folks, Leff Lefferts, Josh Gold, Colette DeHaan, Jeremy Bowker, Pete Horner. We had a wonderful intern / sound design assistant, Nia Hansen, who was brand new here, and we would send her out to do these recordings, and she'd come back with this gold mine. I remember she went on vacation up to her ranch in Canada and came back and said, "Yeah, I got a wolf fight." Really? Okay. We had an amazing Foley team: Sue Fox, Pascal Garneau, Andrea Gard, artist Denny Thorpe, and Jana Vance, and recordist Sean Anglin and Frank Ranella. So these were all a huge part of the reason why this film sounds so great. And specifically, as I mentioned, Nia and a few of these other folks who were a great part of coalescing and gathering this palette for these dragons. So this is a sequence, a montage, a dragon medley of just dragon vocalizations. And why don't we...
Well, before we start, one of the things, I'm glad you really touched on that. The thing about the dragons in this movie is they weren't simple creatures. I mean, this movie, the engine of this movie is the dragons. Like, you have to really be terrified of them at the beginning, and then you have to fall in love with them by the end of the film. So it didn't come down to anything really simple, just like this one sounds kind of walrusy and this one sounds more like a bird, even though those traits are there. We really wanted them to have these unique personalities and be very identifiable. One of the things that continues to amaze me about this movie, I can watch it over and over again, and I continue to hear new sounds coming out of these dragons because they're very, very layered, and they have a very complex makeup. And really, they're pretty awful in the beginning, and that's what we wanted. Like, they're just pretty one-dimensional, horrible creatures that are raiding the village and taking things and burning things down and blowing things up, and they really take delight in that. And then somewhere in the middle of this movie, you start to change how you feel about them, and by the end, they feel like little puppy dogs, and you really sort of feel protective of them, and they're very endearing. And I can't say enough about just the complexity, I guess the density of thought the complexity of thought that went into designing these things. They've got real personalities, and I'm glad we're going to watch this segment, because I'm sure I'm going to hear things I never even heard before, because I continue to hear them. But yeah, pay attention to I guess the personality of these things as we go through, and I think we'll continue to talk about how they differ from one another and how individual they are. As the sounds are as individual as the way they look, and we'll talk about that more, I'm sure.
As a note also, beyond the design of each of the dragons, there was a great interaction that we had to have before we could even start animation on quite a few scenes, where we needed the emotion, the content, emotionally, the performance, vocally from these dragons before we could even send it to the animators. And you'll probably see, I don't know what you've chosen here, but it really did drive the performances visually.
Yeah, I started working on this film about 3 years ago, and one of the first jobs was just to make speculative sounds for these dragons, long before there was any kind of moving image associated with the dragons. And one of the reasons, as Darren said, was to help inspire, Chris and Dean and Darren and the animators, to help give them ideas about what the dragons could look like. And there's something about these kind of real world sounds when you go out and record, a wolf fight or whales or puppies or any of the scores of individual creatures that we'll talk about later that went up to make these dragons. There's something about those real-world, complex, gritty, kind of dirty, three-dimensional sounds that can't help but inspire the look of the creatures as well. So let's play that sequence. Al, you want to give us a little compendium of raw material?
Here's our list. I'm not going to tell you which is which, but I had to write it all down. We recorded many, many animals. Here's a rattle-off. Elephants, horses, dogs, including Paco and Lucy and Sophie and Flash and Amos and Tinker. Paco was the talking chihuahua. He was amazing. Pigs, cats, tigers, cougars, leopards, wolves, koalas, goats, sheep, parrots, pelicans, seals, sea lions, hyenas, otters, owls, crows, and we recorded a Randy Tom too. Mm-hmm. We also experimented with other tonal, non-mammal, non-human sounds, trying to get screeches and rasps and such. So we would record sort of liquidy, slurpy stuff, and violins we recorded, styrofoam, scrapey styrofoam, rubber balloon squeaks, all kinds of things that you can take and you can mix in with mammals and human vocals and get screeches and scrunches and unique vocalization or vocal type sounds. So that's a little bit of our palette anyway.
It's a time-consuming and in some ways fascinating and very frustrating exercise to try to create a character like this using mostly raw material of real-world animals and some humans. Al's voice is in there also, by the way. We usually resort to our voices when we can't find any other way to do it. And so what you wind up doing is trying to mimic the tiger snarl that you have already placed and are in love with in one moment. You mimic that in the next moment enough so that it kind of sounds like the same creature, but it segues into the more sympathetic emotional beat or emotional moment that you need there that you just couldn't get from the tiger. Tigers just find it impossible to sound sympathetic for some reason.
As much as you pet them.
Hey, of all those elements, how much in the combinations came together naturally, and how much did you have to process?
Well, you'll have in your mind a certain, whether you're looking for something raspy or something more, for example, a lot of the descriptions in the beginning where we wanted something whale-like, something marine-like. So you might start with a sea lion or a walrus or a whale sound, but you want it to go into a growl or up into a squeal. And so you start with the basic, but then you start to experiment with something that would maybe provide a squeal or a growl. And you might find an animal that's doing an interesting squeal, but it's just not very exciting or dynamic. And that's when you start to try and go outside of that realm and maybe try a squeak or some bowed metal or something to try and integrate that into that one basic element, the sea lion or the walrus. But I think usually it's common to start with either a human vocalization or an animal vocalization. It depends.
We certainly do an enormous amount of pitch changing of these sounds, and we play sounds backwards. Sometimes a sound that just won't work at all forwards, if you play it backwards, will be perfect and not sound like it's backwards, which is also a trick. But I think so many people who don't know much about this kind of work assume that it's mostly electronically generated somehow, and that's really just couldn't be farther from the truth. What we're doing is in a way very similar to what Gary does when he's mixing dialogue. What you hope for from an actor, from a human actor, is a great performance with interesting dynamics and that seems real and true and believable. And yes, you can do certain things using technology to slightly enhance that performance, but what's essentially wonderful about it is the performance, and so that's what we get from these animals that we record.
It's neat to see them grouped together like that. One of the things that's fun about this is that when I first came on the project, there were so many dragons that we had built for the film, and I was the kid that bought the blueprints for the Starship Enterprise, and I put them all out on my floor, and I studied them very closely. And so, I loved the technical stuff and just the unseen stuff in these things. And the first thing I did when I got on the project was I made these giant lists of traits of each of the dragons, and I broke down like how hot their fire was and what the fuel mixture was in each one. And I wanted to make sure they were all really, really different, even though just in case anybody. And the personality of the dragons was another thing that we attended to. And the first dragon you saw up there was the Gronckle, and he's big. And we wrote this whole almost like a naturalist who'd been observing them. We wrote this big thing about each one of these dragons. And the Gronckle we decided was just basically lazy, and they heap themselves together and spend most of their time sleeping. And when they are awake, they're kind of grumpy and angry and stuff. And you hear that in there. He's more grumbly and just irritated sounding. And then the two-headed dragon. much more snake-like. And again, you hear that, like we figure that one is probably one of the smartest of the, like much more smart than a Gronckle. Real smart dragon, and there's a sort of a Siamese cat sort of a character to it, and you really hear that in there. And then like the big dragon that lights himself on fire, he has a jelly gasoline sort of fire, by the way, that enables him to do that. And he's probably the most dragony of all the dragons, and he's the most aggressive. Like when you see Hiccup in the ring, if you haven't seen the movie, all the Viking teens have to learn to fight dragons when they come of age, and you do that in this training ring. And that dragon that sets himself on fire, that's the big sort of, he's the rock star of dragons. He likes his job. He lights himself on fire, partially just for the effect. And you don't face that dragon until they figure that you're really ready for it. And his sounds are terrifying. He's all aggression. He's the last dragon that you see soften in the film. So it's neat to see all these sounds complex and sandwiched together, and yet they create these wonderful flavors that are true to these character traits that we drew up and shared with everybody here when we first started the project.
The most challenging of all the dragons in terms of the voice creation was Toothless, the star of the show, the smallish black dragon that we saw in the sequence before. And the next and last clip that we're going to play is of a sequence that the filmmakers call Forbidden Friendship, and I want Chris to say something about that.
Yeah, this is an interesting sequence. When we first started the film, this movie was going to be about Vikings and dragons, and they were at war. And by the end of the film, we wanted that to change. And Hiccup, the weakest and most hapless of all the Vikings, creates this friendship with what is considered to be the most terrifying dragon in the world. It's a bit of a ghost, and in the story, no Viking has ever even seen one and lived to tell the tale. So Hiccup ends up in this cove with this dragon for the sequence, and we always knew it was going to be the pivot point, really, of the entire film. This is where these two characters are going to go from enemies to being just tenuous friends, and that's the beginning of this new relationship. Dean and I are such believers in sound and music that this sequence wasn't even written. I come from storyboarding, and so when it came time to do this sequence, I storyboarded it because there was no way to describe it otherwise. And when I storyboarded it knowing that it's not even, I think that to describe it as a tripod missing a leg isn't even, I think, giving it justice. It really is like, it's like an object sitting on a pillar that doesn't even exist. I built it to rely on sound, to be our dialogue. And as you watch it, if you haven't seen it before, even if you have, like the sound and the music that's the language that's being spoken between these two characters in this sequence. And it was really, I mean, it's very, very spare. The whole thing it's so spare in the beginning, and I did these boards, and I think that I'm really glad that nobody freaked out when they saw the storyboards before the sound and the music came in, because it's really characters just staring at each other, waiting for one of them to do something, and I was like, this is going to be great. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be, and I just knew it was going to work. But well, take a look.
Well, the first time we put it together in storyboard form, we basically did it virtually silent with just a very tonal temp music track that was more like a heartbeat, and it kind of drove the progression of that whole sequence. And then when we turned it over, it all just came to life. It's all in the subtlety of the sounds.
Yeah, it's 5 minutes. It's like 5+ minutes of really no dialogue, and just it's so spare. It's funny. It's one of those things. If you take the sound out of the sequence, it's going to feel very, very strange without it there. It's our language, it's our dialogue in this bit.
So let's play that.
Huh. Toothless. I could have sworn you had teeth. No. I don't have any more. Ugh.
The interesting thing about the dragon is that he's a real departure from the other dragons in the movie. The other dragons actually have a lot of these sort of spiky, thin projections and are much more reptilian, and that dragon is much more sort of smooth. He's very smooth and more mammalian. He's also built to do a lot more acting than any of the other dragons in the film, because we knew that this dragon was going to have to bridge this gap between humans and his own species. So there had to be this real analog warmth to his design and also to his sound.
I think all of us were inspired to some degree by a wonderful film called The Black Stallion that was directed by Carol Ballard that has a sequence with a boy and a horse on an island who get to know each other and have in some ways a kind of similar interaction. And Elle and I certainly used horse vocalizations as part of this sequence for Toothless. You hear horse breathing, and we had recordings of mares giving birth in which they do this very labored breathing and sound very emotional, and that was useful in the sequence too.
Yeah, he has sort of a nasally breath, but then he has this breath in his body in other sequences in the movie, especially when he's first captured. His whole body is just pulsing, and he's just breathing from from very deep inside of him. And so we used some of those horse breaths, and it really sat in there nicely.
Most of the comical stuff is Al and me. Pitch changed. Al had to be pitch changed a little more than I did.
I remember one of the first times we came up here to start to go over the design for Toothless in Randy's room, and he was just pulling up different animals and stuff, and then we got to, it was just amazing hearing all of these, everything came from somewhere inside, and it all felt very natural. And then there was this one sound, and we said, "What is that?" And it's like, "Oh, that's Randy."
And now there's a lot of elephant in him as well.
Yeah, elephants make an enormous variety of sounds. When we think of elephants, we mainly think of trumpeting, but elephants and crows and ravens make all kinds of sounds that humans don't get many chances to hear. And in fact, we're interested in collecting more recordings of elephant vocalization. So if anybody out there has any of those, let us know. We're actually going to send some people on an expedition to Thailand to record elephants fairly soon, because there's such a great resource for this kind of work.
You had mentioned something too, in there's almost a subsonic level in their voice and their the size of their ears is actually what allows them to hear each other at miles of distance.
Yeah, we're all big fans of bass frequencies and using the subwoofer in creative ways. And we had a lot of chances to do that with Toothless, to make him seem even larger than he looks, and create sounds that make you feel like you're hearing this rumbling coming from deep inside of him. I wanted to mention again how wonderful I think John Powell's score was for the movie, and you certainly get a sense of it in that sequence.
Yes, I think it was the last piece of music he actually scored for the film, and he was really circling that bit for a very long time, and was really waiting, because I think he knew the significance of that moment as well. Everybody did. This is the pivot point of the entire film, and I think he really wanted to let the rest of the film shape up before he went in and wrote this piece, and so it was the last thing he wrote from the film. I think that the elephant connection actually is a very interesting one, because it was the way we described this dragon from the very beginning, because we would sometimes have to talk about, like, well, what level intelligence is he, because he watches Hiccup draw and he mimics him, and we always actually likened his intelligence to an elephant.
Mm-hmm. And I want to also say again how brave it was of Chris and Dean to create a sequence like this, because I think especially in animated films, there's an inclination to lean pretty heavily on dialogue, on more or less continuous dialogue for storytelling. And this sequence is so cinematic, in the most profound sense of the word. So much of the storytelling comes purely from the visual and from the sound, and you're not literally told what to feel from moment to moment. You have to get it from what you see and what you hear other than human voices. And I can imagine it must have been kind of a hard sell early on to convince everybody that this was going to work.
Yeah, I think everybody was very enamored of it, actually. It was just so different. It was just such a different sequence, and I think when we made that Black Stallion connection, I think people were very excited about it. And I think then you're like, well, I think everybody remembers when they saw that sequence in The Black Stallion and how profoundly it affected them. So now they're like, so it's going to be really great. You're like, it's going to be really great. It's going to be great. Like, I hope it's great. But yeah, we had such confidence in the sound. That to deliver that emotional connection. I think we were never worried about it. I think we were always just very excited to see it start coming together. The animators actually did everything about this sequence is very, very unique. The animators took the storyboards and they took the time to create poses based on the storyboards. And at any moment in the film, or in this sequence, I should say, you try to rig a character to do anything that it may have to do. And so this is a very extensively tested rig. And from the first second of the sequence, I broke it. when the dragon sits back on his tail, he can't do that, and everything about the rig broke. So there's this department called character effects that will come back, and they can really work magic. They can do things that are out of the ordinary, and they're all about doing things like this. So they had to come in, and the animators were snapping that dragon in two all the way through the sequence. At one point he's hanging over a branch of a tree, and he can't do that either. So they had to go in and fix the tail that once we broke it and folded over this tree. So it's really, everything about the sequence was really pushing the boundaries of what we normally do. And everybody just, I think, rose to the challenge, and even the animators, they created these poses months before they actually animated the sequence. They created these poses and sent them on to the other departments to see if they could make those poses work. Because just because the dragon looks nice from the angle that you're looking at him doesn't mean that if you turn him sideways, they haven't rearranged his wings and pulled them off the rig and stuck them in new places so that he would look nice and just visually pleasing in that one pose. And so there's a great deal of manipulation going on with the rig and the sounds of the dragon in the sequence.
Well, I think it's really great that you and Dean weren't very worried about being able to make the sequence work with sound, because Al and I were terrified.
Well, the first time I put it together,
nuances.
the first time we screened it with that sequence complete, I was so worried that we'd come out and they go, oh, well, it stalls there, you're going to have to cut it out. And it was like everybody came out of that screening going, we love that scene. It was such a relief, and especially knowing where it would go, too. Our first cut had Chris doing a lot of the vocalizations for the dragon, doing the
And it was actually a big
so
help.
it was quite a relief
He's
to get
particularly good at that.
swap.
Yeah.
Well, he is Stitch.
Yeah, it's actually a very good tool to have a director go through and do his or her own performance of a creature voiced like that, because it tells you stuff about what you expect emotionally from the character that you probably couldn't get simply by describing it.
I forgot about that, actually. I just remembered when you said that.
Yeah. I think we don't have any more time. Thanks so much for coming.